thorough Lyme Productions. This is Thoroughly Modern Reviewer.
Hello and welcome to the Thoroughly Modern Reviewer podcast. I'm your host Michael, and this week we're going to be talking about American Gods, which has just returned to Starz for its third season. After a nearly 2-year hiatus, American Gods is back on our TV screens, and not a moment too soon. American Gods is one of my favorite TV shows. Its quality is not always consistent, and there's often a lot of turnover behind and in front of the camera, but there's nothing else like it on TV. As usual, there have been a few shakeups in front of and behind the camera. Several cast members have departed, and there's a new showrunner heading the ship. However, despite all of these changes, the show remains a great one. The third season of American Gods feels simultaneously familiar and new. It's still the same show that we all love, but it's bursting with new energy and a lot of momentum. It's not perfect, but it's off to a promising start. Now, before I go any further, if you haven't seen the first episode of Season 3, please don't listen any further. This is primarily going to be a spoiler-free look at the first 4 episodes of the third season, which is what I've seen. However, I may spoil a little bit of the first episode because it has already aired by the time this podcast goes live. So, having said that, let's get on with it. Season 3 picks up a few months after Season 2's conclusion, and it sees all of our main characters having split up and gone their separate ways. Shadow's been hiding out in Milwaukee, avoiding his role in Wednesday's war. Mr. Wednesday has continued traversing the country, recruiting old gods for his war, and obtaining worship however he can get it, like attending a Blood Death concert led by Marilyn Manson's Johann. Bilquis has returned to her apartment in New York to obtain her worship the way she used to in the first season. The new gods have relocated to a new base and are working towards the launch of a mysterious app called Shard. Laura has been searching for a way to resurrect Mad Sweeney, which has brought her to New Orleans, where she encounters Baron Samedi and Maman Brigitte. But they've had very little luck in resurrecting Mad Sweeney thus far. And it's just one of those, everybody has been split up again, as is often the case in American Gods, but very quickly everyone will end up back together. Now at first, this time jump was kind of a little jarring to me because I kind of expected the show to pick up directly where the last season ended, which is what the first season did. And last season ended with Shadow on a bus seemingly headed toward Lakeside, and so to see him not there is kind of jarring. However, I think the time jump works remarkably well. You know, with the new change in showrunners, there's stuff that's going to get retconned, like the Season 2 finale featured that whole thing where there was like an attack on the financial system, and there was a manhunt for Shadow and Wednesday, and just all of that is basically ignored. It gets referenced at one point when Miss World, played by Dominique Jackson in this first episode, when she looks at Tech Boy and says that he's royally messed up several things, including turning what should have been an intelligence gathering operation into a war against Shadow, but none of these things matter. There doesn't seem to be any kind of repercussions for that attack on the financial system. It's gone. But the time jump allows this creative team the room to pick which plot lines they want to keep and which ones they don't. But it also gives them the room to kind of organically sow the seeds for the future plot lines. The time jump kind of feels like a new reboot, which makes this first episode feel a bit like a pilot for a new show. But the show is still identifiably American Gods. It's still the same show it's always been. There's just some tweaks now. And the biggest and most immediate tweak that I noticed is that the show has more narrative momentum than it used to. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still a really slow-paced show. The characters inch their way towards the war rather than running towards it. However, there just feels like there's more going on. As the season begins, every character has a defined objective that they are seeking to fulfill, and every episode follows some combination of those characters as they work to fulfill their objectives. And this all gives the show a sort of forward thrust that it's been sorely missing. For example, Shadow wants to learn more about himself, and he ends up in Lakeside working on doing just that. Wednesday is still continuing to recruit the old gods and raise money for his war effort, which, surprise, surprise, the show actually tackles how Wednesday gets the money that you would need to wage such a ridiculous kind of war. And while he is going on this quest, he ends up coming across some figures from his past, like Dennis O'Hare's Tyr and Blythe Danner's Demeter, who kind of shake Wednesday's world a little bit. Salim has been ditched by the Jinn. Musa Kraish is not returning this season, so Salim is trying to pick up the pieces of his life in the wake of the Jinn's departure. Bilquis is experiencing a similar crisis of faith, with her powers acting in sort of surprising ways, as you sort of see with the way that her scene with Tech Boy in the first episode concludes. She experiences some weirdness there, and so she turns to the Orishas, which are Yoruba gods and goddesses. They're gods from a particular part of Africa. I don't remember which part offhand. So she turns to them for help and guidance. Speaking of Technical Boy, he's trying to prove himself to World, because he keeps messing up. He messed up his upgrade, he messed up that whole intelligence gathering thing at the end of Season 2. He just keeps messing up, and he is on the thinnest of thin ice with World. World tasks him with convincing Bilquis to join their side, and with obtaining the funding needed to finish work on that app I mentioned, the Shard app, which seems to be, it's sort of vague as to what it exactly is, but it seems to be some kind of thing that's going to let the new gods tap into humanity's conscience to get worship that way. No idea what's going on there, but they need funding for it, and it is up to Tech Boy to get that funding. However, when he goes to see Bilquis, she triggers some kind of either memory or vision or something, some kind of feeling of war that really messes up Tech Boy, and he's left kind of in pieces almost. And so he's going to end up needing to go down his own journey of personal discovery. And then, of course, there's Laura. Laura has failed to resurrect Mad Sweeney, and in an act of just utter desperation, she cuts the coin out of her chest, gives it to him, and that seems to fail too. And so she's going to have to confront her personal demons so that she can find a way to enact her revenge on Wednesday. I can't really say anything more about that, because that is like a super spoiler as to what exactly she's going to be doing to confront those demons, but she will have to confront her past. Now, I say all of this because these clearly defined objectives give every episode of the season a sense of forward momentum, even if the greater storyline of the series isn't moving particularly quickly toward an endpoint. It seems like it would be storytelling 101 to have a plot that is very clearly driven by character actions, but as anybody who's been watching this show would know, that has rarely been the case with American Gods. And honestly, it's really, really nice to see the show finally embrace that kind of thing. If you have characters who are interesting to follow, then you're going to follow them even if the bigger storyline is kind of taking its time. Because you're going to want to know how Shadow confronts these things, and how Wednesday convinces everyone to join him, and how Laura overcomes her demons, and how Tech Boy gains world's favor. You're going to want to know all of these things, and so having each episode kind of focus on what specifically these characters are trying to do is going to help propel everything forward. There's no sense of the narrative treading water in these episodes. Everything is just moving forward, and it's just really, really effective. The other tweaks end up mainly being stylistic ones. There are cold opens now, which are short pre-opening credits sequences, and each of them take the form of a coming to America story, which we've seen primarily in the first season, where they're those ones that are narrated by Mr. Ibis, and they're explaining how a god came to America. Well, they're not always narrated by Mr. Ibis here. However, they do open up each episode, and each one of them is tied into the theme of that particular episode. It either introduces a god who's going to appear in the episode, or it just sort of sets up the general, theme of the episode. And it works really well. It's really nice to see the return of these vignettes, because I think everybody can agree they were a highlight of the first season, though they sort of didn't always feel like they fit in with what was going on. So it's nice to see them return in a fashion that more clearly ties them into the actual plot of the show. Also, placing them in front of the opening credits ends up making a lot of sense, because it just it acts as like an appetizer for the episode. Because like I said, they often establish what is going to be important in that episode, whether it's a god or a theme. And so the point of a cold open is to set up the episode. And so with these coming to America vignettes setting up the episodes, it all just kind of works really, really well. The other noticeable stylistic tweak is in the number of storylines that each episode follows. Like I said, there are a lot of plots happening all at once, and all of them end up giving the show that forward momentum. Season 2 began to split each episode's time between the various characters and their plot lines, but Season 3 leans even harder into it. If my memory serves, every single episode follows at least 3 plot lines. There's a main one, which is often Shadow's plotline, though not always. Then there is a B one, which is often either Wednesday or Shadow's plotline, depending on who is leading the episode. And then there's a C plotline, which is usually like Bilquis or Tech Boy or Laura, something like that. Although that is not a hard rule, like that varies, but this is just sort of the general idea. Sometimes there's even more than 3 plotlines in an episode. Now, all of this works well, except for when it doesn't. Sometimes, a lot of it comes down to the editing. When you've got this many plot lines, it can be difficult to cut back and forth between them. You see it a little bit in the premiere, where you feel like you're just settling into a plot line and then you're yanked to another one. This is not the case all the time. Episodes 2 and 4 handle their plot lines really well, where there are very naturalistic shifts between the plot lines, but episode 3 is just really clunky. And it's a bit of a shame, because that clunkiness does kind of end up harming the show's feeling of momentum. It's hard to establish forward momentum when you don't stay in a scene long enough to understand, what's actually happened. However, cutting between plot lines like this does help the show feel like it's going forward, because within one of those plot lines, you're going to see some character make some kind of progress, and that really does make you feel like the show isn't just standing in place. So it's finding that balancing act, and I don't think the show has quite found the balancing act of finding the rhythm between cutting between these storylines. I think it's a great idea to have multiple storylines in an episode and to cut between them. I'm just not sure that the show has quite found that rhythm just yet. But there are still 6 episodes that I haven't seen, and maybe by the end of them, the show will have found that rhythm. I think these first 4 episodes are a solid beginning here. There's a confidence to the storytelling that the previous season completely lacked. You know, when you're watching season 2, it really does feel like a ship without a captain. Nobody is in charge of where it's going, and so there is a total lack of confidence to the storytelling. That is not the case here. It's clear that the new showrunner, Charles Iglee, and Neil Gaiman, and the rest of the creative team have an end goal in mind for the season, and every episode so far seems to be working toward that goal. Each episode builds off of the previous one, and it gives the whole thing both a sense of unity and also a sense of purpose. When you ground the series in a town like Lakeside, that opens up a bunch of storytelling avenues. There's an ongoing storyline where various children in Lakeside keep going missing, and the townsfolk are having to react to that and try to find them, and it's a storyline that draws Shadow into it, and it gives Shadow the chance to actually be proactive and do something, rather than just react to all of the weird stuff the gods do like he's been doing. It's the same thing with the whole why I think it's a good idea that they revealed that Wednesday was Shadow's father earlier in the show than they did in the book, because it gives Shadow the chance to do things of his own accord. It gives him agency. Like I said, the characters feel more clearly defined than ever. The cast are all excellent, both the returning characters and the new ones. Everyone is giving something exciting to do. They're giving something meaty to work with. And it's really impressive how well the new cast members slot in amongst the returning ones. Some of the immediate standouts are Ashley Reyes as Cordelia, who is Wednesday's... She's kind of replacing Shadow in Wednesday's relationship. She drives Wednesday around. She helps him with tech stuff. But she's really fun, and her scenes with Shadow end up being kind of interesting, and I'm excited to see what they do with those two. Julia Sweeney plays Hinzelman. Hinzelman is a guy in the book, but the character has been gender bent for the show. She's great. She feels like that kind of town grandmother who knows everyone, and who everybody kind of likes, but also kind of hates. If you've read the book, you know a little bit more about what is going on than people who have not read the book. However, Julia Sweeney is just so fun, and every time she's on screen, it is such a delight to watch. Layla Lauren is Marguerite Olson, who is Shadow's neighbor in Lakeside. She works for the town newspaper, and her and Shadow don't necessarily hit it off particularly well immediately, but they do grow a nice bond that they share with each other, and both Lauren and Ricky Whittle share a really nice chemistry together, so that their scenes are also very fun to watch. And then, of course, there's Dominique Jackson as Miss World. There are various incarnations of Mr. World who appear in the season. Crispin Glover returns later on, and Danny Trejo also plays the character later in the season. However, Dominique Jackson is the one that we meet in the first episode, and man, she is like electric. If Crispin Glover's Mr. World is full of like quiet rage, then Dominique Jackson's is the one who would just cut your throat without thinking twice. She is great, and I love what they're doing with her. Now, to be fair, every member of the cast brings their A game. There is no weak link here. All of the returning cast members are great. It's nice seeing Ricky Whittle have more to do here, like I've said. Emily Browning does a lot of really cool stuff with Laura's plotline that I can say absolutely nothing about. The same is true for Yetide Badaki. God, I'm going to butcher names here. But she, as always, is fantastic as Bilquis. And the journey that Bilquis goes on in these episodes is kind of a difficult one. And Badaki plays it brilliantly. You're just so captivated by her. Bruce Langley continues to be that perfect mixture of smarmy and charming, where you hate him, but you love him, but you also kind of want to strangle him. He's perfect as Technical Boy, and I'm really pleased they're kind of continuing to develop Technical Boy as a more complex character than he is in the book. I like that he is not necessarily on board with whatever World is doing. That is kind of delightful, and I'm really interested to see where that goes. Aside from the cast, the show still maintains that unique visual flair that it has always had. Of course, it looks a little bit different than it did in Season 1, because nobody can perfectly replicate the visuals of a Bryan Fuller show. However, this season still looks really good. The CGI is great. It's so clear that time has been spent on making this show look as good as it can. It's beautiful. There's gorgeous cinematography, there are breathtaking effects, and what is really kind of best about this show, and has always been best about this show, is that the moments of fantasy always feel rooted in the characters and their stories instead of as pure spectacle. Nobody's just walking around making magic happen. All of it feels very purposeful and grounded, and it makes everything feel real instead of, just sort of silly. Now, that being said, these first 4 episodes are not entirely perfect. As has always been the case, the dialogue can be a little bit hit or miss. It ranges between being needlessly obtuse to really clunky and cheesy. Like I said earlier, the editing isn't always great. Sometimes it's clunky, sometimes there are weird audio cues. Especially in the 4th episode, there's one audio cue there that legitimately made me laugh out loud at a moment that I don't think was intended to be comedic. A few of the returning characters feel sidelined in these episodes, most notably Demore Barnes' Mr. Ibis and Omid Abtahi's Salim. They both appear all too briefly in one episode. However, the promotional material suggests they will play a bigger part in the season. They just haven't really done that yet. So if you're fans of them, hang tight. They're gonna appear at some point. Probably. Like I said earlier, several plot points from the previous season are just completely dropped. Some of them are mentioned a little bit, but a lot of them are just completely ignored. It's understandable for there to be retconning. However, I do wish that they did a little bit better job with the retconning. I wish certain things had been more gracefully written off, shall we say. This is particularly true for some of the characters who are missing. Mr. Nancy and New Media, both characters that are not in the show, are just literally not mentioned. Nancy's absence is not remarked upon by anybody, nor is New Media's. New Media seems to have been replaced by a bunch of nameless henchmen who seem to be doing very similar things to what she would have done. And there's just no explanation as to why she's gone when literally the last time we saw her, she was leading this whole big fake news thing against Shadow. So, those dropping those kinds of things with no explanation is not great, Like, it's understandable to drop things that you don't think are working. I just think that you should do a better job at explaining why you're dropping them. Because, if people watch this show in 10 years and don't know anything about, the behind-the-scenes drama, they're just going to be like, wait, why is this character just not here anymore? They seemed like a really important character. Why are they gone? If you don't have the context, the real-world context as to why the actors are gone, you don't know what's going on. And I think the show should at least acknowledge that it's writing characters off. And kind of on a similar note, there's a theme for the season that emerges. It's primarily introduced through the storyline featuring the Orishas and Bilquis, and it feels fairly at odds with a major theme of the past 2 seasons. Gone is Mr. Nancy's angry gets done mantra. Now the Orishas are calling for unity. This is going to be a polarizing decision, especially with the way that the show and Orlando Jones parted company. I mean, I feel like there are valid points to either theme, and it all depends upon execution. So it's difficult to know whether this is a worthwhile change or not, but it's certainly going to be a polarizing one, and it stands out like a sore thumb. It's really difficult to read that theme as anything other than a you to Mr. Nancy, you know? And I don't know if that's how it's meant, but it absolutely kind of feels that way, and it's going to really upset some people. But even with these problems, the show works more often than it doesn't. And there are so many interesting ideas and character arcs that are set up in these first few episodes. Honestly, I can't imagine it would be difficult for a viewer to find themselves drawn in to some aspect of the show. Whether it's the actors or the setting or whatever. There is something that is going to draw your attention. Of course, it remains to be seen whether or not the season will stick the landing, or if it'll fall into the trap that has ensnared previous seasons, one that is of great ideas that end up going nowhere. But, based on what I've seen so far, I am pretty hopeful. These episodes are exciting, they're well-paced, and they reintroduce everyone to a world they've grown to love. I can't wait to see what the rest of the season does with the story that's set up in these episodes, and I'm so excited that the show is back. I love American Gods, even with all of its problems. I love it. And that's going to do it for this week's Thoroughly Modern Reviewer. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at ThoroughlyMe. You can visit the website at thoroughly-modernreviewer.com, where you can find more reviews, more coverage of your favorite entertainment topics, and more information about this podcast. If you want to subscribe to the podcast, you can do that wherever you get podcasts. And guys, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a marvelous week. We'll see you next time.